just heard Kurt Vile with Loading Zones here on 88.1 FM WVYC, and a good afternoon to you all. This is the voice of your college, and my name is Keelan Tollinger, and I'm your host for the 3 o'clock hour. Thanks for tuning into this show on Friday, October 26th, well over the midway point of the semester by now, I think. If you think it's flying by, you're not alone. It's actually pretty crazy to me how, though the days may be filled with lots of work and you're ready to collapse by the end of each of them, step back and think that you're more than halfway through, and it'll be done before you know it, by the third week of December. Only about 7 to 8 weeks left at this point. Yeah, you could do it. By the way, I just shook hands with congressional candidate George Scott in the Democratic election coming up soon, and I guess I just want to stop by and see the station manager. Instead, he found me in a side room finalizing my notes for this show, and I pointed him in the direction of Sparks Den's student lounge if he wants to meet more people like me. But yeah, that was quite a surprise today, I guess. I digress. Just remember that if you missed last week's lengthy episode about interactions between humans and technology, don't forget you can go to youtube.com and search In the Studio with Keelan Tollinger to hear an archived version of it, as well as every previous show before it. What's on tap for this week includes a lot of national events. So an expert in immigration has been attending York College for the week and gave a lecture on Monday about the migration crisis. Let's see, and I'll try to boil down the mess with the Saudi Arabian journalist who disappeared at the beginning of the month and is only now being confirmed that he was killed. The suspicious explosive packages appearing all over the country sent to several prominent Democrats, also in the news. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I'll find some time to tell you how York College's men's soccer team did in an important match on Wednesday, the final game of the regular season. All of that is on its way after in this hour of In the Studio, and as I often do, I'll throw in a song to kick off the afternoon. You are listening to the voice of your college on 88.1 FM WVYC, and this is Turnover with New Scream. I'll be right back in a few. Welcome back to 88.1 FM WVYC, the voice of your college. That was Turnover with New Scream here on WVYC. So to get things started, I want to talk a little bit about this interesting lecture that I went to on Monday night here on campus with former White House advisor on immigration, Angela Kelly. I got acquainted with this event, I'd say, a few weeks ago when the station was going to prepare a public service announcement about it. And you might have heard it read a few times on here. I made up my mind I was going to sit in on it last weekend when I read an email from my literary theory professor that you would get extra credit in store if members of our class showed up. So I went there with about 3 others that I knew. There was also the fact that Angela Kelly was going to be visiting our class on Tuesday, so I thought it'd be wise to get acquainted with the lecturer before she joins our discussions. And just a side note, that didn't quite work out. We just had a normal class that day, but I'm still glad that I went because these issues on immigration are especially pertinent in today's news, where we heard about this migrant caravan that had been trying to get from the Guatemalan to the Mexican border, and some of President Trump's tough rhetoric of what's going to happen should those thousands and thousands of people get to America. So very early on, well before anything happened in that lecture, this lecturer wanted everything to be pretty open and inviting most of all. So, because I was in an aisle seat in the auditorium and I guess appearing young and capable, my professor asked me if I could get like a pair of chairs from a classroom nearby with the help of another student, some comfortable seating. And instead of a traditional talk in front of a microphone, we ended up all seeing this former presidential advisor in the middle of the stage floor, seated beside the professor. It was a pretty casual setting. That I guess I helped arrange, but she wanted everyone to call her Angie after she was formally introduced too. Anyway, so just to preface and clear up some things, I think she established she hadn't really met face-to-face with President Obama before. It wasn't like she was at his right hand on policymaking. She was more advising the advisors from within her Washington, D.C. organization that I believe researched and gathered and examined all the moving parts of the immigration front, primarily in the South American regions from what she was concerned with. Because she herself is the daughter of South American immigrants, taught to learn English at a young age, and married an American teacher who instructs Spanish speakers to learn English. And coupled with her occupation as a lawyer right out of school, Angie was building this personal connection between 2 different communities and the people she was signed up to represent in court. And so, for instance, before her job at the White House, she was sort of tasked with meeting, like, a woman and her infant son that had come across illegally from the border. And Angie needed to understand to get to the reason why this desire to move was so great. Because if you're going to be taken in as a refugee, there has to be a clear danger that an individual faced, like living conditions or a social situation that's used as evidence in front of a judge to convince a case. And with that example, the migrant woman and her son, Angie's story with her is that a gang tried to take this young mother away and force her into becoming a stranger's boyfriend, as forceful as an arranged marriage, basically. After the first no, a group broke into her house and put a gun to her 2-year-old's head. Still, the answer was no, and nothing unfortunate happened, but before the third time, this woman was fleeing for the United States the next day. It's these individual faces in the crowd that Angie wanted to help, to get them the assistance they truly needed when they came with nothing but the clothes on their back, and the pleading wish not be sent the way they came. Once the administration changed, Mrs. Kelly remarked a bit that a lot of the work she and her colleagues had done, like some of them she's still keeping in touch with ties to the White House, it's a bit unfortunate that a lot of the work they've done is being changed around or reversed. And the motivation for a lot of these moves is mostly fear to her, from what she feels. The officials' fear of all these migrants being murderers, rapists, and drug addicts, if I can borrow the words of President Trump. That claim from his campaign days is still the same phrasing he's throwing around in his tweets over this caravan. And I think it shows his stubbornness to not examine this issue another time over now that he's in office, and probably has more than enough opportunities to hear the standpoint of the lawyers, the social workers, the people who've worked with these folks coming across the border and know their identities far better than what we can imagine hearing it through the media. And to make matters more difficult, she told us to imagine, for instance, the big rooms full of public policymakers, of white men, white women too, maybe not as in touch with this particular issue from their homogenous backgrounds of being often consistently referred to as Americans. I liked Angie's thought that if all representatives could vote anonymously without fear of party lines, for example, there might be a lot more transparency and progress about getting this issue solved. And then with the question and answer part that we had towards the end, one of the interesting suggestions and solutions that I heard pitched from other members to Angie was over the fact that we in the United States don't have a big overcrowding problem as we think. You might assume that's the case, but where that claim's the most relevant is in the major cities across the country. There is plenty of space in the rural parts of America, the states with less population density, away from the South and towards the Midwest and Northwest, where tons upon tons of unused acreage is waiting. And the prospect was perhaps encourage more migrants out of all the ones that come to America for any reason to consider somewhere less popular. Make more economic centers and cultural crossroads in the less dense areas of our country. I think Angie said that there is an organized system in the Mexican government to help immigrants in their country that apply for some assistance to get help finding all of the basics, like a location to live in, a job to go to right out of the gate, to encourage this self-sustaining lifestyle where mostly all it takes is just someone to go and point in a direction and just guide workers to there. And could we in America have more widespread usage of that? It would take a lot more manpower for starters, but the undeniable thing is that we have the space and the areas we might want to focus on that are just sitting there and could be contributing to an economy, like the jobs and the services there. And I think a lot of what that whole session of question and answer pertained to was debunking some myths as well. Kelly claimed that it's not inherently racist to think or suggest that the border security needs to be enforced, or that we need to stick to our plans with background checks. There's no one calling for the complete evaporation of the perimeter fence. And what I think Kelly wants to accomplish is to make the process of being adjusted into this nation a lot more fair and give attention for everybody. For the woman and her child fleeing gang violence to the New Zealander who came to America for the university and wants to stay as a citizen. It's a difficult goal to eventually reach that middle ground that works for everybody, which cares for the individual wanting to come in without overwhelming or disgruntling the person already here. You know what they always say about families who have been here for generations and have gotten comfortable over that fact? That to simply shun away immigrants and block them out Surely sounds a bit ironic when you go back to how we muscled in to find space with the Native Americans. I'll tell you one thing that I guess relates to this mass gathering of migrants trying to get through to our nation. While numbers, like groups of marchers, are a powerful thing, it'd be a bit ludicrous to have all these folks coming in together, and even catastrophic to assemble troops and bring out police with riot gear to form human barricades when stationary ones won't cut it. On one hand, it's asking a lot to deal with a whole influx of people you have to round up, detain, and sort out. In America, we're not equipped to do all that in a moment's notice. But for the immigrants traveling by foot, making this incredible, tiring walk all the way, saying they have to do this to get away from deteriorating conditions in their other Hispanic countries, I just wish those living conditions were better so that they wouldn't have to make a break for another land in the first place. There's so many problems with obviously the gangs, the dysfunctional governments, the economies, that what makes our country such a magnet is the deplorable quality of life in parts of South America that obviously aren't being fixed, see no signs of improving. And so our migrant crisis is the result. But overall, I think it was a very fine, polite discussion we had in that lecture hall on Monday evening without any messy political debate. But all that talk needs to lead to action someday, in some specific form, and hopefully we get there. We need to first kind of erase or get to the bottom of the stigma we base our assumptions on for why these immigrants are here. That's not to murder and sexually assault and steal welfare, basically. It's ultimately that want to be an American, to have that independence and that control of life that we as citizens here can't imagine going what some Hispanics have endured decades without. And that's just about all I'm going to provide on this issue for now. It's a very complex topic that is some pretty thick lines drawn in our national government that aren't going to budge anytime soon for the time being. We'll move on to the first weather check of the afternoon here on York College's campus. And anyway, let's get into some more music. So coming up next on WVYC, here is a tune from the European trio Peter, Bjorn, and John. They just released another album named Darker Days last Friday. A very alternative rock foundation with sort of dreary, blurry undertones to it. This is Wrapped Around the Axle. You're listening to 88.1 FM, the voice of York College, and I'll return in a short while. Welcome back to 88.1 FM, WVYC, the voice of York College. That was Peter, Bjorn, and John with Wrapped Around the Axle. And let's move on to the next topic of the afternoon. So no doubt that you've heard the story about Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi Arabian journalist whose disappearance has led to an international investigation with tons of finger-pointing. I guess the only place to begin on this whole thing is the day outside of the Saudi Arabian consulate in the country of Turkey. That was October 2nd, where Khashoggi tried to obtain marriage papers inside the building, but hours later, as his fiancée waited for him outside, he never came back out. We had the two conflicting stories from both of the countries involved within days, that Saudi Arabia had no idea where this journalist could have gone, and Turkey claiming that Khashoggi was killed and then his body was cut up. There was no hard evidence to confirm either of these outcomes, though, except the fact that he was still missing. When asked to get to the bottom of this issue, to perhaps hold Saudi Arabia accountable, President Trump, of course, wanted to lean towards caution. It could have maybe been some rogue agents acting alone that got a hold of Khashoggi. Saudi Arabia are our allies, and I've spoken to the king, who firmly denies it, and so I have my doubts about it. And then the headlines began to emerge that perhaps there were a group of over a dozen Saudi Arabian men that had flown to Istanbul, Turkey, by a jet or two, and were seen in the consulate. Part of the speculation was that each of these men were under the direction of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and couldn't have acted without some command from him, whether that have been an intentional or accidental cause of death. There were reports of perhaps a body double being seen around the city of Istanbul after this journalist's supposed disappearance that would suggest a cover-up. That actor hasn't been totally confirmed yet. But it took until this week for Saudi Arabia to finally admit that Khashoggi was dead, that upon collaborating with Turkey's side of the story, that there were Saudis responsible for this incident and that about 20 men or so were being detained. The CIA director flew out to the country earlier this week and apparently heard audio to suggest that this journalist was going to be interrogated, and that led to some sort of altercation. One thing led to another, and whoops, there was some sort of fatal mistake from what I saw reported. on like a statement made by the country's national television that there was a hand-to-hand fight, and Khashoggi was put into a chokehold that obviously injured him pretty significantly. And yet still his body hasn't completely turned up, whole or not. There isn't a definite reason as to why these lengths had to be taken to. And what a lot of news sources establish is that while Khashoggi was once an insider to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia in some way, like he advised the royal family, he's slowly become disconnected with the inner circle and, for instance, wrote articles in the Washington Post being a bit critical of what I'd suppose is the leadership of this young ruler. He was not a turncoat by any means yet, but he did flee from the country and lived for a time here in the United States to get away from that place. And if this incident, this interrogation, was supposed to be a powerful form of persuasion to get him to come back to Saudi Arabia's side or something, I think he still died a pretty resilient person from, at least what we're seeing, a pretty shady rule. And Trump has at least acknowledged that this is one of the worst cover-ups ever, a complete 180 now that the Saudis' admission of guilt has come forward. And now at least I hope he acts upon it a little bit. He can't deny anymore that this kingdom has done nothing wrong, that the prince himself has said this is a heinous crime, and people will be held accountable, and they're even restructuring some of their intelligence systems, dealing with the people involved. Now, what'll have to be seen if these changes actually warrant any new behavior in the future. But from our perspective as Americans, I think this Middle Eastern country is still a bit of a mystery to us. And we know that they're rich in oil money, if you want to put a basic fact like that out there. They only just allowed women to drive on their own in the June of this year. And to have at least the admission of guilt from the Saudis could be sort of like leverage, I guess. And if Trump knows what he's doing, he can say to the Saudis, like, if we're really allies, you need to stop doing that. And he can also take the initiative like what the United Kingdom and France are doing and condemn them. And it's much easier to hold Saudi Arabia at fault than, say, North Korea, who we all know imprisons and murders hundreds and hundreds of defectors on a regular basis but never admits to it. And Trump can look the other way for the most part about that and not have to deal with the fact that there isn't outright in his face about a country doing something wrong. And perhaps you could even say the same thing about Russia, who's just as easily suspected sometimes of making people disappear, supposedly. And what we can maybe find some reassurance in is that no matter how much we complain about censorship problems and the like, the freedom of the press and freedom of speech is alive and well in this country. Like, God forbid there are federal agents that come and arrest and beat reporters and critics on how this country is run. We might abuse some of those freedoms in a sense that not everything has to be entirely accurate in the media cycle these days. But for the most part, we live comfortably with the fact that journalists can say what they want and not face a threat from a higher power here. Just a lot of ill will and negative remarks from people on the other side of the aisle. But what finally bugs me about this a bit is just the slowness and the contradictory nature that this whole story had surrounding it for 3 weeks on end. And it still looks like it isn't over. Even the good side is like taking its time to get the story straight. Will there be the discovery of a dismembered body or not? Was it a detail made to inflame the suspicion over the Saudis? The BBC says the search has turned towards a forest in Belgrade to discover the remains. So we'll see what comes out of that. But whatever the case, here's hoping that the United States re-examines their status with Saudi Arabia over the fact that it doesn't bode well to be an ally of yet another country with a shifty nature. Jamal Khashoggi lived in the United States here since 2017, and that to me is basically a citizen seeking more freedom of expression and getting gravely punished once he stepped out of our soil. And that's all of the information I've got on this whole saga, and I'm sure it'll continue on after this particular show. I think it's a good time to get the PSA of the hour out of the way since we're about 3:30 on the dot. And coming up next on The Voice of Your College, some tunes from the station playlist with Everett Bird and Paranoid. You're listening to 88.1 FM, and I will return in a little bit. Welcome back to 88.1 FM, WVYC, the voice of your college. That was Everett Bird with Paranoid. And I'm going to get back into some of my monologuing just to briefly cover another story that is rapidly unfolding even at this hour. I want to talk about this crazy week for prominent Democrats and critics of this presidential administration. Obviously, this is about those suspicious packages, these dozen or so pipe bombs that they were trying to track down who was a senator, as they've been arriving since Monday morning. If you haven't heard yet, at this hour, around 11 o'clock or so, they've arrested a man who they believe is either the head criminal or an accomplice. CNN took about an hour earlier this afternoon showing a vehicle that's related to this whole incident. A white van covered with stickers of some kind in every window, and it wound up covered with this giant blue tarp before being loaded onto a flatbed truck and taken to a nearby FBI facility. Along the way, the tarp actually slipped off and showed a number of these decals with President Trump's portrait, a little box saying CNN sucks. It's just like, the news media is still slowly releasing all the details of this, and by the time I'm broadcasting, it might be a little bit out of date. They did release his identity as a man in his 50s, Cesar Sayoc, someone with a criminal history in the past, ties to New York, and most importantly, a proximity to the mail center in Florida that the FBI only started scrutinizing last night just before I went to bed. And they did work pretty quick on this investigation, I've got to say. But to recap for a moment, we had the names of George Soros, major Democratic donor, Bill and Hillary Clinton's residence in New York. Wednesday was a massive day with the Obamas, former CDI director John Brennan, Democratic Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, after the package was supposed to be delivered to Attorney General Eric Holder, but that got turned around to the return address. 2 to Maxine Waters in her Los Angeles address and Washington, D.C. On Thursday, Robert De Niro's company received another one of these similar packages. Then Joe Biden received a pair of them. And just this morning, the FBI intercepted a package in Florida for New Jersey Representative Eric Booker. And finally, one addressed to James Clapper, a CNN contributor taken out of the mail sorting facility in New York. And I just read this actually that Democratic Senator in California, Kamala Harris, and donor Tom Steyer were just intercepted as well. So that is a lot to break down. Just like, firstly, so many instances where things could have gone wrong. Over a dozen or so of these pipe bombs, they were saying that many of these had explosive white powder for fireworks in them, and shards of glass and other shrapnel, perhaps triggering mechanisms, and the digital clocks on them. But none of them went off early in transport, being jostled and thrown around in carrier vehicles. And the staff, the Secret Service, and these people who surveil these packages picked these out and were able to take them out of transportation before they could arrive in the hands of the actual recipients. That's fantastic work on their part. I think there is a bit of a mystery that surrounds the motives of all this, however. You obviously need to examine the timing of these so close to Election Day. And there's also been remarks here and there that with the construction of these pipe bombs, they weren't very obvious to decide when exactly they were supposed to go off, if at all. Perhaps they were just intended to spark suspicion that this list of Democratic targets was the work of some politically supercharged Republican. And that actually seems to be the case. People were throwing around a convoluted conspiracy theory that just it's somebody pretending to be a Republican, but it seems like in the past couple hours, they've been digging through this Mr. Sayoc's social media pages of Twitter posts of him holding a campaign poster for Trump and Pence, Twitter history where he's been sort of continually accusing the Democrats of supporting ISIS and stuff like that. But moving on from that, I'd also say without a doubt, this is domestic terrorism, just from the fact that whatever the case was, it sowed paranoia and fear across the country, whether or not these explosives actually went off, whether they were supposed to. It made people afraid of the boxes from the Postal Service just sitting out in the open again. And at least now there's the potential to get to the bottom of this now that the suspect is in custody, and we can maybe know the reasons for sure, which is a lot more optimistic than, say, the case of Mark Anthony Conditt, the young man who sent from March 2nd to the 20th of this year 5 false packages to seemingly random people in Texas, which ended up killing and injuring civilians and police officers. Now, to go back to President Trump and his response to this whole ordeal, I saw a story of a Wednesday night political rally that he held where he was sort of downplaying the criminality and the troublesome side of the Democrats. He called for unity and peace between sides, which, yes, spoken through words and not with actions is a bit of a stretch. But I'd like for this to be a sign that perhaps igniting passion and hate towards the other side of the political spectrum is just going to put people at risk. In this case, it was prominent individuals, but carrying that incentive out on everyday civilians is just as likely the more folks hear that their opponents have no good points to make, that they just need to be rubbed out of existence. And he blamed the media for being the roots of some of this divisive talk, but just remember, they're covering him first, but undeniably putting spins from time to time in their reporting and analyzing afterwards. This is a problem that stems from a variety of sources, these accusations and name-calling, and I just hope all these political debates get put aside very soon. And best case scenario, I'd say, is for it all to get settled at the ballot box. So it's time to get out there and vote. And I'm going to take a little break from this topic in particular and change gears to some sports in a little while. Coming up next is a throwback to the origins of alternative rock. This is The Smiths with their classic There Is a Light That Never Goes Out here on 88.1 FM WVYC. I'll return in a few. Welcome back to 88.1 FM WVYC, the voice of your college. That was The Smiths with There Is a Light That Never Goes Out. And it's about time to get into another weather check here on WVYC, so give me just a sec to load that up. And now to stop going so much into national news and focus on something a little more local. So some college sports. Now, the soccer teams here at your college play their seasons in the fall, and for the past 4 years or so, I've been actively following the men's side. Ever since freshman year, basically, and I've gone to about every single one except 5 or 6 of them. Either my schedule wouldn't be open or I was too busy with work. I think when I first started coming to this school, it took me about 3 or 4 games to realize that we have a soccer team here, and they play their matches across the campus on the West Field. I will go and check those out. And being a person who didn't really have anyone else I knew who was into soccer, I was always kind of like this lone pilgrim who'd make trips on weekday evenings or weekend afternoons from Maine to West with just a backpack and a couple of cans of brisk iced tea and go to one of the small bleacher seats alongside the Grumbacher Center. The parents and the older fans hang out in the large multiple road stands past the concessions, but students who came alone or with a small set of friends would wind up in this disjointed section all in the corner of the one goal. But that was always a good enough vantage point for me. Anyway, the last scheduled home game of the men's season was Wednesday night. It was the last regular season match as well, and that was likely the final one that I get to see. Coming to the close of all those days here and there throughout the fall semester where I'd make plans to see how the team would do, I'm going to kind of miss the cold afternoons sitting on the bleachers and drumming my feet for warmth. The sunny early September evenings where I buy a green Gatorade from the snack bar out of the superstition that the specific color of it helps the team. Going to those events was sometimes the break I needed from college work. Times where I always look forwards to whether they turned out positive or negative. And in reality, I think it's the first type of experience that as a senior, I have to pack away. But to go where I wanted to go with this whole topic was the result of this last soccer game on home turf. Because that turned out to be a massacre of Salisbury University, a team I'd say is a big Capital Athletic Conference rival for them. Last year in the regular season, for instance, York met Salisbury at their university and wound up with a 1-1 tie. That was evened up after a Salisbury player scored in the last 6 minutes of the 90 to drag the game into double overtime. Then they went their separate ways. Then in the postseason, the playoff rounds that the CAC has to have to determine a champion, these two schools met again at York and tied 1-1 again. The difference maker was that a penalty shootout had to be played after the double OT, and Salisbury slipped by to the second round after an 8-7 result. It was a heartbreaker. It was also emotionally charged leading up to that result because of 15 fouls for Salisbury and 14 fouls for York. It was incredibly chippy, and the thought was that when this opponent rolls back into York for the regular season this year, it could be a wild game. Salisbury had 11 wins, 2 losses, and 2 ties coming in. York with 9 wins, 5 losses, and 2 ties. Both teams just want to have a good note to end on since they were both playoff bound, and they'd probably see each other again. So it was time to make a statement for York to get that upset in. Especially since last Saturday afternoon, 6-win, 8-loss Frostburg State University threw a wrench into their plans and upset the Spartans first. That was a brutal 0-1 loss, where Frostburg scored in the first 5 minutes, and it was just defense that won them that game. And people on York's sideline kicked their equipment bags. The players were tearing off their wristbands and throwing them to the turf. It was just frustrating, and that result lost them the opportunity to have a home field advantage for any of the upcoming playoff games. So to turn the end of the season around, York had to end this campaign on a good note against Salisbury, and God, they definitely did. It took about 7 minutes for York to get on the board. That was from a swinging, crossing ball in front of the goal. That tall defender, Mark Murgo, jumped and knocked it in with his head. Awesome start. In the 33rd minute, and this is a great redemption story, Salisbury was trying to clear the ball out of the box in front of their goal, and it got intercepted by Nate Bilby. The Nate Bilby, who's been a constant player on the field since sophomore year. He'll be graduating in my class. He was injured the first couple of games in the beginning of the season, and only had 3 goals up to that point that night, which was kind of an anomaly. Nate Bilby is, in my opinion, the most versatile person on the team, who has great touch on all of his passes and sets up so many shots for the forward players up the field. Everyone knew him as this guy with, and I'm not kidding, incredibly healthy, long blonde hair to his shoulders. Now, I hope it's no offense to say that it's watching Barbie week in and week out, but he chopped most of his hair off this season, I think, and I didn't really understand the reason why. And one thing for sure that happened is that against Salisbury in the playoffs last year, during the penalty kick shootout to decide everything, Bilby was the first person for York to step up and start the team off, because with the consistency of his leg, you need to begin the duel off right and score early. But he had that shot blocked. Here he was again in the 33rd minute of this game, standing maybe 15 yards away, this time with traffic of Salisbury and York players in his way. But Bilby fired and scored, 2-0 going into halftime against these rivals, and it was kind of becoming a storybook ending. Another big player for York stepped up in the second half around the 60th minute and made an impact as well. That was Keith Witherall. I think the shortest player on the squad at 5'5", but he is so fast. He just takes off and changes direction quick with his low distance to the ground. And someone tried to lob the ball at the goalkeeper, and he got his hands on it. But then he dropped it out of his hands for just a single bounce. And Keith comes flying in and prods it into the back of the net. And though he collided with the goalie, he got a piece of the ball, and that made it 3-0. The party could begin at that point, except it was too cold, nobody wanted to really move. But still, with hot chocolate, with the concession stands in my grasp, I stuck it out and wanted to see if this game could wrap up any more lopsided. And then 2 substitute players recorded their first goals of the season within a minute of each other. Ali Demiri stole the ball from the foot of a Salisbury player, looked up, and saw the goalkeeper was standing outside of his goal, and just arced it up from 35 yards away into the net. That was in the 84th minute. And like I said, 60 seconds later, here comes Chase Crable, a freshman with hardly any time on the field this season, but he prodded the ball away from a defender and started running one-on-one towards the goalkeeper. And to make an already awful night for him, the shot from Chase went straight through the hands of this guy as he was trying to drop to the ground to scoop it up off the field, and that was the 5th and final goal of the night. Just amazing and tons of fun to be attending that. And the weird thing about this season, I've got to say, is just the difference between their home and away records. It was so up and down watching from the bleachers this year. The Spartans had 3 wins and 3 losses and 1 tie at home. It was just so average. And yet, away from home, the games I couldn't see, 7 wins, 2 losses, and 1 tie. That draw being against the team that wound up leading the conference this year, Mary Washington University. And so far, this college team hasn't exactly lifted itself to the highest echelons of glory or something. I think the furthest in these 4 years has been a loss in the semifinals. But it'll be interesting to see if this is the year where they finally contest for the championship. I believe they are taking their best record under head coach Evan Sheffy into the postseason this time, and with the away games they're so good at for probably the entire tournament. The first round is tomorrow at upset-minded Frostburg State again, and at the very least it'll likely be live streamed online with the camera pivoting back and forth between the action, no sound. So if I'm not busy, I'll check it out and maybe keep tabs on their tournament run. But that wraps about all I have to say about the men's soccer team. It was well worth it to attend all their games that I could, even if there was never an ending that let all the students storm the field or something. It's just that seeing matches that were not as professional as the high-paid, world-class stars in the upper leagues, just like scrappy people like my age representing my school, I think it made a load of memories that I'm glad to have enjoyed for relatively nothing in exchange. It is about 3:54 here at your College of Pennsylvania, and I'm going to jump into a quick commercial break, and I will be back here in just a little bit. Stay tuned.
College radio can pretty much be summed up in 5 words. Dead air. Dead air.
Well, not on this station. You're listening to the only college radio without yeah, you get the picture.
This is WVYC.
College radio. Done right.
And welcome back. My name is Keelan Tollinger. Just a couple minutes left until I have to head out of here. Just a small story before I head out from the studio there. Just really quick. Just look this up. So back in September, a police department in Blackpool, England, was trying to track down a man caught on surveillance footage stealing a case of beer or something. They posted it on Twitter to try and see if anyone could track down the thief, and of course, when social media is involved, these things get on the global stage is sometimes a big mistake. The man in the surveillance shot had a face that clearly looked like David Schwimmer. He was the actor who played Ross from the sitcom Friends way back when. And thousands of people started making the same connection, saying, it's Ross, it's like the celebrity guy, and he must have fallen on hard times. They were all just trying to be humorous, of course, but this wouldn't be much of a story unless David Schwimmer himself caught wind of this and decided to clear his name. He made a post on Twitter just this week saying, officers, it wasn't me. As you can see, I was in New York. Good luck with the investigation, Blackpool police. And then he had someone record him in the aisle of a supermarket, hurrying past the camera, looking up like the suspect did, fumbling with a crate of beers in his arm as well. It's very safe to say that he wasn't actually involved, but the internet got some more fuel to the inside joke. I've never really watched Friends. But on the other hand, I don't think they've still caught the actual shoplifter from September yet. And that's kind of surprising because you think there has to be at least a person who knows this David Schwimmer lookalike. Like, the police could even go through a database of faces and question everyone that bears a resemblance to him or something. I can't, even imagine the daily life for someone that looks uncannily like a celebrity and gets mixed up all the time. I mean, I guess it can be beneficial to get handshakes, high fives, selfies, maybe an autograph, at least a really, really convincing Halloween costume, but that's about it. Anyway, that's about all the material that I have for this edition of In the Studio. Remember that every weekend I try to have an archive of these shows uploaded to my YouTube channel. That's In the Studio with Keelan Tollinger that you can search for, and you can revisit these monologues again at your leisure. I'll be back again next week for more news and music at 3 p.m. on Fridays. So until next time, take care and have a good weekend. We will leave things off with Supertramp and Take the Long Way Home. Have a good weekend, everybody.